My name is Leah Carmichael. I'm 29 years old, and until 8 months ago, I thought I understood what it meant to have a family. I was 6 months pregnant when my mother-in-law stood up at my baby shower in front of 40 people and announced that the baby inside me didn't belong to her son. I need you to sit with that for a second. A baby shower. The streamers were still hanging. There was a half-eaten piece of cake on the table in front of me, and the woman who had hugged me in my wedding, who had cried when we told her I was pregnant, stood up and said those words like she'd been rehearsing them for weeks. Maybe she had. Before I tell you what my husband did next, and I promise you, you won't see it coming. Make sure you subscribe to Heartway Stories and drop your country in the comments below. I love knowing where you're watching from. Now let me tell you everything. My husband's name is Thomas. We met 6 years ago through a mutual friend at a fundraiser for a local animal shelter. I remember he was the only person there who actually spent time with the dogs instead of just taking photos for Instagram. I thought, whoever this man is, he's the real thing. I grew up in a small town in rural Ohio. My mom worked double shifts at a diner for most of my childhood. My dad did HVAC repairs out of the back of a pickup truck. We weren't poor in the way people romanticize. We were poor in the way that meant I wore the same pair of sneakers for 2 school years and pretended not to notice when kids laughed. There was no safety net. There was just my parents, working, always working, and telling me that as long as I had my integrity, I had everything. Thomas's family was different. His father, Mr. Drackley Whitmore, built a regional distribution company from scratch and turned it into something worth serious money by the time Thomas was in high school. They had a house in Connecticut with a guest wing. They had a last name that meant something in certain circles. They had opinions about everything: what Thomas should study, who he should marry, what zip code he should live in. When Thomas brought me home the first time, his mother, Mrs. Whitmore, smiled with her mouth but not her eyes. She complimented my dress in a way that made it sound like a question. His father shook my hand firmly and then asked Thomas, right in front of me, where exactly I was from again. I told myself it was just first meeting nerves, that they'd warm up, that love wins, and all of that. Some of it was true. Thomas's younger sister, Amanda, was genuinely kind to me from the beginning. She texted me after that first dinner just to say she thought I was great and to ignore her parents because they did that with everyone. I held on to that message for a long time, but the parents never really warmed up. It was always subtle enough that I couldn't call it out directly. A comment about Thomas's college roommate who was now a hedge fund manager, a story about someone's daughter who had married well, an offhand remark about how different things must be for me compared to what I grew up with, said with a smile, always with a smile, so that if I reacted, I'd look like the sensitive one. Thomas saw it. He always saw it. He'd squeeze my hand under the table, and later in the car, he'd say, "You handled that beautifully. You don't have to keep handling it. I'll say something." And I'd tell him not to, because I didn't want to be the reason there was tension. I kept absorbing it because I loved him and I didn't want our relationship to cost him his family. We got married 3 years after we met. Small ceremony, his family's estate. It was beautiful. In the photos, everyone looks happy. I've looked at those photos a lot recently, trying to find the thing I missed. When I found out I was pregnant, I cried in the bathroom of our apartment for 20 minutes before I walked out and told Thomas. He picked me up off the ground. Actually picked me up, laughing and crying at the same time, saying, "Are you serious? Are you serious?" over and over. It's one of the best memories I have. His parents' reaction was more controlled. His mother said, "How wonderful," and moved on to asking about whether we'd thought about schools. His father talked about setting up a trust. The warmth was administrative, but I told myself it was fine. People express love differently. This was still love, just in their language. The baby shower was his mother's idea. She insisted on hosting. I thought it was a gesture of acceptance, finally. I thought maybe this baby was the thing that would close the distance between us. I spent the weeks leading up to it feeling genuinely hopeful. The morning of the shower, I remember getting dressed in the bathroom and talking to my stomach. I told my baby that today was going to be a good day, that the whole family was going to be there, that she was already so loved. 40 people in that living room. My mother drove up from Ohio, my 2 best friends from college, Thomas's colleagues, neighbors, and all of his family, his parents, his aunts and uncles, cousins, his sister Amanda sitting in the front row. Everything was fine for the first hour. Really fine. There was food and laughter, and someone had made a diaper cake that looked architecturally impressive. People were taking photos and asking about names and touching my stomach with permission. I was happy. I want to be clear about that. I was genuinely, completely happy. Then his mother stood up. She said she wanted to make a toast. People quieted down and picked up their glasses. I smiled at her from across the room. She said she had something she needed to share, that had been weighing on her for a long time. That she'd been holding on to information out of love for her son, but that she couldn't stay silent anymore. Not with so much at stake. I felt the first drop of cold in my chest before she even said it. She said she had reason to believe. She actually used those words, reason to believe, that the child I was carrying was not Thomas's. The room didn't go completely silent. It went into that strange half-silence where you can still hear ice settling in glasses and someone's chair scraping the floor and a single person near the back whispering, "What?" My mother made a sound I'd never heard from her before. His mother kept talking. She said a friend of hers had told her about seeing me with another man several months ago. She said she had asked a private investigator to look into it, and then she reached into the bag at her feet and pulled out a folder. She put photographs on the table. Printed photographs, like she'd prepared a presentation. I couldn't speak. I could not form a single word. I just stood there with my hand on my stomach and watched people lean in to look at those photos. I heard voices. "That's her, isn't it?" "The timeline matches." I knew something was off. Thomas was standing near the kitchen doorway. I looked at him across the room. His face had gone completely still. His mother looked at him and said, "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I didn't want to do this today, but you deserve the truth." His aunt said something about how she'd always had a bad feeling. His father, standing near the fireplace, said nothing, just watched. My mother stood up from her chair. She said loudly, "That is my daughter and she would never." But voices started talking over her, the room fracturing into smaller arguments and whispers, and I watched my mother's face as she realized no one was listening to her either. I said, "That's not true." My voice came out smaller than I intended. I don't know where those photos came from or what they're supposed to show, but I have never been with anyone else. Ever. His mother looked at me with something that I can only describe as practiced sympathy. "Leah," she said softly, "no one wants this to be real." And that's when I broke. Not angry broke. Scared broke. The kind of broken where your legs stop feeling like they belong to you, and the room gets very bright and very loud at the same time. I started crying in the way I hate crying, ugly and uncontrolled. And I kept saying, "I don't know that man. I've never met him. I don't know what those pictures are." Nobody moved toward me. Except Thomas. He walked across the room. Not quickly, not dramatically, just steadily, the way he moves when he's made a decision. He walked to where the photos were on the table and he picked them up and he looked at them for a long moment. Then he set them down. He looked at his mother and he said, calmly, "Where did you get these?" It wasn't a question. It was the kind of sentence that closes a door. His mother started to explain about the private investigator, the friend who had seen us, the timeline. Thomas held up his hand. Just one hand, and she stopped. He walked to me and put his arm around me and turned to face the room, and he said, "I know my wife. I have known her for 6 years. She's the most honest person I have ever met in my life, and there is not a single part of me that believes this." His uncle started to say something about the photos. "I don't care about the photos," Thomas said. His voice wasn't raised. That was the thing. He didn't need to raise it. "I care about the fact that my mother just did this, here, today, in front of everyone we know." His mother said, "Thomas, I did this for you. You did not do this for me," he said. The room was completely silent now. He looked at his father. His father looked at the floor. Thomas said, "We're leaving." He said it to me, not to the room. He picked up my bag from the chair. He kept his arm around me. And we walked out. I remember the sound of Amanda calling his name as we passed her. I remember my mother grabbing my hand for just a second before Thomas guided me toward the door. I remember the afternoon sunlight hitting the porch steps and thinking how wrong it looked, how ordinary, how the world outside had no idea what had just happened in that room. We sat in the car in the driveway for a few minutes. I couldn't stop shaking. Thomas didn't start the engine right away. He just sat there, and then he reached over and held my face in both hands and made me look at him. He said, "I need you to hear me. I believe you. Completely." "That's not going to change," I said. "Those photos are fake," he said, "or taken out of context, or something." "But I know you, Leah. I know you." I asked him what we were going to do. He said, "I'm going to find out where those photos came from and who put my mother up to this, because she didn't come up with this on her own." He was right about that. The next 2 weeks, Thomas worked at the focus of someone who had decided that the truth was the only acceptable outcome. He hired his own private investigator, not his mother's. He went back through every detail of those photos, the metadata, the locations, who could have had access to images of me without my knowledge. He barely slept. I watched him at his desk at 2 in the morning, cross-referencing things on his laptop, making calls I wasn't privy to. He kept saying, "I'm close, I'm close." What he found took my breath away. The photographs had been taken by someone who had been following me for about 3 weeks, not Thomas, not a stranger. Someone who had been hired to do exactly this, to build a dossier that could be used to make me look unfaithful. The person who hired them was not a stranger. It was his father. Mr. Whitmore had gone to a private investigation firm 4 months before the baby shower. He had explained that he believed his daughter-in-law was being unfaithful and he wanted documentation. The investigator had found nothing because there was nothing to find, so the materials had been fabricated. Photographs of me in public places, edited to include a man standing close enough to imply intimacy, a fake timeline. A folder that looked official enough to convince a room full of people who wanted to be convinced. Thomas found all of this. He sat on it for 24 hours, I think because some part of him needed time to accept what his father had done. Then he called his parents and told them to meet him at their house. I went with him. He held my hand the entire drive. When we walked in, his mother immediately started talking about how she'd been worried about him, about how she hoped we could sit down as a family and work through this together. His father stood near the window with his arms crossed. Thomas let her finish. Then he laid out everything he'd found. The investigator's name. The timeline of when his father had first made contact. The evidence that the photos had been fabricated. He put it on the table the same way his mother had put those photographs on the table at the shower. And I thought about how much intention that took. His mother's face went from defensive to pale. His father didn't deny it. That surprised me. He just stood there for a moment, and then he said that he had done what he believed was necessary, that he'd seen signs, that he had a responsibility to protect his son and his family's legacy from a mistake. A mistake. He called me a mistake. Thomas said, very quietly, "She is not a mistake. She's my wife. She is carrying my child, and you hired someone to destroy her reputation in front of everyone we know." His father started to say something about legacy, about what the family had built. Thomas said, "I don't want it." Silence. "I don't want any of it," Thomas said again. "Not if this is what it costs." His mother started crying. She said she hadn't known about his father's involvement, that she'd believed the photos were real, that she never would have, and I don't know how much of that was true. I still don't know. But I watched Thomas look at her for a long moment, and I could see him trying to calculate how much of her guilt was genuine and how much of it was about consequences. He said, "I'm going to need a long time before I can be in the same room with either of you." His father said, "Thomas." "A long time," Thomas said again. We left. Amanda called me that night. She was crying. She said she'd had no idea, that she never would have sat in that room if she'd known, that she was so sorry. I believe her. I do. She's been a constant presence since then, checking in, offering to help with the baby, showing up with food when I was too exhausted to cook. The family is not all one thing. I've had to remind myself of that. The investigator who fabricated the materials was reported. Thomas made sure of that. His father quietly settled a civil matter rather than let it become public. I won't share the details, but there were consequences. Real ones. The kind the room full of people at that shower never got to see. But they happened. And I know they happened. And that matters to me more than I expected it to. Our daughter was born 11 weeks after that. We named her June, after no one in particular, just because it sounded like the start of something. Thomas was in the room holding my hand, and when June was born and they put her on my chest, he leaned down and he was crying and he said, "She looks exactly like you." I've thought a lot about what it means to be believed, how rare it actually is. How many women stand in a room full of people and have the truth on their side and still get buried under someone else's story? I was lucky that the person next to me knew me better than the photographs did. Not everyone gets that. His parents have reached out twice since June was born, once through a card, once through Amanda. Thomas has not responded. I don't push him either way. That's his wound to tend to on his own timeline. What I know is this. I am 29 years old. I have a daughter named June who makes a sound like a question when she wakes up from naps, like she's genuinely curious about what she missed. I have a husband who walked out of a room full of his family and didn't look back. And I have a mother who drove 4 hours from Ohio for a baby shower and stood up for me even when no one was listening. That's what I have. It turns out that's enough. It's more than enough. If you're watching this and you've ever been the person in the room that no one believes, I hope you have one person who knows you the way Thomas knows me. Just one. That's all it takes. Drop your country in the comments. And if this story moved you at all, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. I'll see you in the next one. I've thought about what Thomas's father actually believed he was doing. I don't think he saw himself as a villain. I think he genuinely believed that protecting his family's money and name was the same thing as protecting his son. That's the part that stays with me. Not the anger of it, but the logic of it. How a person can construct an entire justification for something cruel and call it love. That's what I mean when I say that what happened to me wasn't just about one bad decision. It was the results of years of choices. His father choosing status over decency, his mother choosing comfort over honesty, and somewhere in there, a quiet assumption that I could be removed if the right pressure was applied. That's not a single moment. That's a pattern. And patterns don't appear overnight. What I know now is that integrity is not something you perform in the good moments. It's what you do when the room is full of people, and the easier thing, the socially safer thing, the financially smarter thing would be to stay quiet or go along. Thomas didn't punch anyone. He didn't make a speech. He just told the truth about what he knew, picked up my bag, and walked me out. That was it. And that was everything. I think about the version of this story where he hesitates, where he says, "Let me look into this first," where he pulls away just slightly because 40 people are watching and his parents are standing right there, and the doubt creeps in the way. Doubt always does when someone plants it with enough confidence. I understand that version. I'm not naive enough to think that choosing clearly in a moment like that is easy or automatic. It isn't. It requires something. Some baseline of self-knowledge, some prior decision about who you are and what you won't do, that most people never actually make out loud. Thomas had made that decision. Maybe not consciously, but it was there, and I think that's what resilience actually looks like when you strip away all the inspirational language. It's not bouncing back, it's not being strong, it's just knowing yourself well enough that when the pressure hits, you don't become someone you're not. As for me, I spent a long time trying to earn approval from people who had already decided I wasn't worth it. I adjusted how I dressed. I softened how I spoke. I absorbed small cruelties because I didn't want to be the one who caused problems. I thought that was grace. I think now it was fear dressed up as patience. The difference matters. Grace comes from a full place. What I was doing came from a hollow one. The part of me that still believed I needed to prove something. June changed that, not in a dramatic way, just in the way that holding your daughter at 3 in the morning when she makes that little questioning sound and looks up at you, makes very clear what is real and what is noise. The noise was loud for a while, but it was always just noise. What Mr. Whitmore did had consequences. Real, legal, documented consequences. Not because the universe corrects itself, I don't believe in that kind of automatic accounting, but because Thomas was methodical and patient and refused to let it go. That's the part people don't see in these stories. Justice, when it comes, usually comes because someone chose to pursue it deliberately and didn't stop. That takes intelligence, that takes endurance, and it takes the moral clarity to know that letting it go quietly would have been its own kind of harm. I'm not the same person I was the morning of that baby shower. I don't think I'll ever go back to absorbing things quietly just to keep a peace that was never real to begin with. That's not bitterness. That's just knowing, finally, what I'm worth and deciding to act like it.